Sometimes the biggest events in the world begin quietly, with a decision made in a distant room, far from the people whose lives will be changed by it. Today I'd like to take you on a journey through one of those times. A time when two powerful nations pulled an entire country into the middle of their struggle, and the people of Afghanistan found themselves living through a war they did not choose. The Cold War was a period of intense geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, lasting from the end of World War II in 1945 until the early 1990s. Though it was called a war, there was no direct large-scale fighting between the two superpowers. Instead, it was marked by a constant state of political and military rivalry, espionage, propaganda, and the threat of nuclear conflict. Both sides represented very different worldviews. The United States stood for liberal democracy and capitalist economies, where individuals had the right to own property and businesses. In contrast, the Soviet Union promoted a communist ideology, emphasizing state control over production, wealth redistribution, and one-party rule. These opposing beliefs created deep mistrust and fear. Each side sought to spread its influence across the globe. The U.S. formed alliances such as NATO and supported governments that opposed communism. The Soviet Union did the same through the Warsaw Pact, and by supporting revolutionary movements in developing countries. The Cold War influenced nearly every region of the world, as the two superpowers competed for strategic dominance, often through proxy wars. Conflicts fought in other countries where the U.S. and USSR backed opposing sides. The arms race was another key feature, with both nations building massive nuclear arsenals, leading to a dangerous balance of power known as mutually assured destruction. Neither side dared to launch a nuclear attack, knowing it would lead to total destruction on both ends. This global tension shaped political decisions, economic policies, and even everyday life for millions of people. Fear of espionage, infiltration, and ideological corruption affected culture, education, and media. Though the Cold War never erupted into open war between the two superpowers, it defined an era of uncertainty, confrontation, and ideological struggle that deeply influenced the world for nearly half a century. In 1978, Afghanistan underwent a dramatic political shift known as the Sour Revolution, in which the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, a communist party, overthrew the existing government and established a pro-Soviet regime. This new leadership, heavily influenced by Marxist-Leninist ideology, sought to modernize Afghan society rapidly through land reforms, the promotion of women's rights, and secular education. However, these policies were introduced without sensitivity to the country's deeply rooted Islamic and tribal traditions. As a result, they were met with widespread resistance, especially in rural areas where conservative values held strong. Many Afghans viewed the new government not only as illegitimate, but also as foreign and anti-Islamic. The PDPA's internal divisions further weakened its rule. Two rival factions within the party, Khalq and Parcham, engaged in power struggles, purges and repression, which led to political instability and violence. The government's harsh crackdowns on dissent, mass arrests, and executions created fear and resentment among the population. Traditional tribal leaders, religious scholars, and villagers began organizing against the communist regime. This growing opposition eventually gave rise to an armed resistance movement, with groups uniting under the banner of jihad or holy struggle to defend their religion and homeland from the government they saw as a puppet of a foreign ideology. The country quickly descended into chaos, with uprisings breaking out in several provinces. The PDPA, unable to control the rebellion and fearing the collapse of their rule, sought greater military support from the Soviet Union. The unrest in Afghanistan, combined with concerns in Moscow about losing a strategic ally in the region, and the spread of Western influence near its borders, set the stage for the Soviet decision to intervene directly. The internal conflict within Afghanistan had now become entangled in the broader geopolitical tensions of the Cold War. On December 24, 1979, the Soviet Union launched a large-scale military invasion of Afghanistan, marking the beginning of a brutal conflict that would last nearly a decade. The decision was driven by a combination of strategic concerns and internal instability within Afghanistan. The Soviet leadership, led by Leonid Brezhnev, feared the collapse of the communist regime in Kabul and the possible rise of an Islamic, pro-Western government near its southern border. They believed a swift military intervention would stabilize the country, secure Soviet interests, and preserve a friendly socialist government. The invasion began with the deployment of around 80,000 Soviet troops, quickly increasing in the months that followed. Soviet special forces targeted key government buildings, military installations, and communication centers. One of the first and most decisive actions was the assassination of Afghanistan's then-president, Hafizullah Amin, who had fallen out of favor with Moscow due to his erratic behavior and failure to control the rebellion. The Soviets replaced him with Babrak Karmal, a member of the rival Parcham faction of the PDPA, hoping his leadership would calm tensions and gain broader support. However, instead of stabilizing the situation, the Soviet presence intensified the conflict. Rather than accepting the new government, many Afghans viewed the invasion as a violation of their sovereignty and a direct attack on Islam. This perception fueled the growth of the Mujahideen resistance, which began organizing guerrilla attacks against Soviet forces and their Afghan allies. The Soviets quickly found themselves embroiled in a war they had not anticipated, one fought in difficult terrain against a motivated and decentralized enemy. The invasion drew widespread international condemnation, leading to diplomatic fallout, including the US-led boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. What the Soviet Union hoped would be a short intervention turned into a costly and drawn-out conflict with no easy victory. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan sparked a strong international response, particularly from the United States and its allies, who saw the conflict as a critical front in the broader Cold War struggle. The United States, under President Jimmy Carter and later President Ronald Reagan, viewed the Soviet move as an aggressive expansion of communist influence into a geopolitically vital region near the Persian Gulf. In response, the U.S. began supporting the Afghan resistance, known as the Mujahideen, through a covert operation known as Operation Cyclone. This program became one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in CIA history. The U.S. funneled billions of dollars in weapons, training, and supplies to various Afghan guerrilla groups. However, the U.S. did not act alone. Pakistan, particularly its intelligence agency, the ISI, played a central role in channeling this support, selecting which resistance groups received aid and how it was distributed. Saudi Arabia also contributed significant funding, motivated by a desire to support fellow Muslims and counter Soviet atheism. China, though communist, also opposed Soviet expansion and provided military equipment to the Mujahideen. This international backing transformed the Afghan resistance into a well-armed and resourceful force capable of inflicting significant damage on Soviet troops. The Mujahideen used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run operations, ambushes, and their knowledge of Afghanistan's rugged terrain to resist the technologically superior Soviet military. As the conflict dragged on, it drained Soviet resources and morale. Meanwhile, Western media coverage of the war, especially stories highlighting Afghan civilian suffering and Soviet brutality, helped build global support for the Mujahideen cause. The war in Afghanistan thus became a proxy conflict, where local fighters, supported by global powers, fought not just for control of Afghanistan, but also as part of the larger ideological battle between communism and capitalism that defined the Cold War era. The Soviet-Afghan War had a devastating impact on Afghanistan and its people. Over the course of the nearly decade-long conflict, more than 1 million Afghans were killed, many of them civilians caught in crossfire, bombings, or reprisals. Entire villages were destroyed, and fertile lands were laid to waste as Soviet forces conducted brutal counterinsurgency operations aimed at crushing the Mujahideen. These operations often included aerial bombardments, the use of landmines, and the targeting of suspected rebel sympathizers, which further deepened resentment among the population and fueled the insurgency. In addition to the massive death toll, The war created one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century. Nearly 5 million Afghans, roughly one-third of the population at the time, fled the country to escape the violence. Most of these refugees sought shelter in neighboring Pakistan and Iran, where they lived in overcrowded camps under difficult conditions. Many children grew up knowing only life in exile, without access to proper education, healthcare, or stability. Inside Afghanistan, the war tore apart the social fabric of communities. Traditional power structures were weakened, and tribal divisions were exacerbated. The economy, already fragile before the invasion, collapsed under the pressure of war. Infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, roads, and water systems was either destroyed or left to deteriorate, leaving the country in a state of near-total ruin by the end of the 1980s. The psychological trauma of the war affected an entire generation, with widespread cases of PTSD, grief, and loss becoming part of everyday life. The use of child soldiers, the rise in war orphans, and the exposure to extreme violence further destabilized Afghan society. These long-lasting effects set the stage for future unrest and made post-war recovery incredibly challenging for the Afghan people in the years that followed. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union found itself increasingly burdened by the war in Afghanistan. The military campaign, initially expected to be a quick intervention, had turned into a costly and unpopular quagmire. Soviet troops faced relentless guerrilla warfare from the Mujahideen, who were being supplied and supported by a wide network of international allies. The rugged Afghan terrain, the decentralized resistance, and the lack of popular support made it nearly impossible for Soviet forces to establish control. At the same time, the war was draining the Soviet economy, which was already struggling under the weight of inefficiencies, stagnation, and a costly arms race with the West. Internally, Soviet citizens grew disillusioned with the war as the number of casualties rose and the justification for intervention weakened. The Soviet leadership under Mikhail Gorbachev began to prioritize reform and recognize that continued involvement in Afghanistan was unsustainable. Gorbachev introduced policies like glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, aiming to modernize the Soviet system and improve relations with the West. As part of this broader shift, he initiated diplomatic efforts to end the war. In 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed by Afghanistan, Pakistan, the United States, and the Soviet Union, setting the terms for a phased withdrawal. The Soviet withdrawal began in May 1988 and was completed by February 1989, marking the end of direct Soviet involvement. Though the Soviets had propped up a puppet government in Kabul, it remained weak and eventually collapsed in 1992. The war had a profound impact on the Soviet Union, contributing to its declining credibility and accelerating internal dissent. Many historians view the Soviet defeat in Afghanistan as one of the key factors that led to the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The power vacuum left behind in Afghanistan would later fuel civil war and the rise of extremist groups. Certainly. Here's a conclusion that ties together the entire speech on the Cold War and Soviet invasion, 1979-1989, in a calm, reflective tone, consistent with the Mr. Rogers-inspired style. My friends, when we look back at the story of the Cold War and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we see more than just battles, governments, and strategies. We see a world where fear and power often led nations to make choices that deeply affected the lives of ordinary people. In Afghanistan, families were caught between superpowers, caught between ideologies, caught in the middle of a struggle that was never truly theirs to begin with. The history is complex, with many sides and many voices. But one truth stays clear. The cost of war is always greatest for those who have the least power, for the children who lost their homes, for the parents who had to flee, for the country that was left broken long after the soldiers went home. This story reminds us how important it is to understand, to care, and to remember. Because when we truly see the human side of history, we begin to understand that peace is not just the absence of war. It's the presence of empathy, respect, and responsibility. And though we cannot change the past, we can choose how we live in the present. We can listen more, judge less, and care deeply about what happens to others, even those far away. That's how we make the world just a little more gentle, a little more kind, and a little more peaceful. Thank you for taking this time to remember and reflect.